The year is 1852. The setting is the suffocating, humid embrace of Marion County, Florida. Here, the air is so thick with moisture and heat that it feels less like an atmosphere and more like a physical weight pressing down on the chest. Deep within this subtropical wilderness lies Riverbend Plantation, a sprawling agricultural empire carved out of the ancient cypress swamps. It is a place of immense beauty and terrible suffering, where the Spanish moss drapes over the live oaks like the gray, tattered shrouds of ghosts. But amidst the brutal routine of cotton and cane, a different kind of darkness was descending upon the slave quarters, a mystery that would baffle the finest medical minds of the South and strike terror into the hearts of the enslaved community. This story centers on a woman named Ilara. She was the plantation's head midwife, a woman of indeterminate age but ancient wisdom, whose calloused, gentle hands were the first human touch felt by hundreds of newborns on the estate. In the hierarchy of the plantation, the midwife held a position of sacred trust. She was the gatekeeper between the void and the living world. But starting in the early spring of 1852, Ilara became the witness and perhaps the architect of a chilling anomaly. It began with a single birth. A young woman named Sarah was in labor for 14 hours. The birthing cabin, a small wooden shack set apart from the main quarters, was filled with the sounds of agony and exhaustion. Ilara did what she had always done. She wiped brows. She whispered ancient comforts. She guided the life into the world. When the child finally crowned and slipped into Ilara's waiting hands, the room braced for the inevitable sound that defines human existence. The first cry. That sharp, piercing wail that signals the lungs have cleared, that the spirit has entered the body, that life has begun. But that night, there was no sound. The baby, a healthy boy, opened his eyes. His chest rose and fell in a perfect rhythmic cadence. He was pink, he was warm, and he was alive. But he was utterly silent. Ilara cleared his airway, turned him over, rubbed his back. Standard procedures to induce that crucial scream. Nothing. The child simply stared up at her with an unsettling calmness, breathing the stagnant Florida air without a whimper. At first, it was dismissed as a fluke, a shock to the system. But then, it happened again. And again. Throughout the sweltering months of 1852, every single child delivered by Ilara arrived in absolute silence. It defied all medical logic of the 19th century. Newborns cry. It is a physiological necessity to expand the lungs. Yet, under Ilara's touch, the infants of Riverbend defied nature. They were born with their eyes wide open, their breathing steady, but their voices locked away. The phenomenon sent shock waves through the enslaved population. Mothers began to look at their swelling bellies with dread rather than hope. In a world where survival depended on flying under the radar, a silent child might seem like a blessing. A baby that wouldn't cry when the overseer passed by. A baby that wouldn't reveal a hiding spot. But to the mothers, this silence felt like a curse. It felt like the babies were born without souls, or perhaps born with the knowledge of the life of servitude awaiting them, rendering them speechless with grief before they even took a breath. Word eventually drifted up from the quarters to the big house. The plantation owner, Silas Caldwell, and the local physicians he employed were initially dismissive. Slaves were property to them, and as long as the property was healthy and could eventually work, they cared little for the nuances of their birth. However, the consistency of the phenomenon began to unsettle the white masters. A silent slave quarter is a dangerous thing. Noise means life, activity, and presence. Silence implies secrets. Doctors were summoned from Augustin and beyond. They examined the newborns, prodding their throats and listening to their hearts, with the primitive stethoscopes of the era. They found no blockages, no deformities, no illness. The children could make sound. They would coo or cough days later, but the birth itself, that violent transition into the world, was devoid of the primal scream. They called it a medical miracle. They called it a biological oddity. But in the hushed whispers of the night, as the fog rolled off the river, the masters began to wonder if it was something else entirely. Was it a disease? A genetic defect spreading through their stock? Or was it, as the superstitious overseers muttered, a dark form of resistance orchestrated by the midwife herself? Ilara stood at the center of this storm, silent as the children she delivered, holding a secret that the history books would try to erase. Welcome to Slavery Stories, a digital archive dedicated to unearthing the submerged narratives of the American past. We are here to navigate beyond the well-trodden paths of textbook history, venturing instead into the dimly lit corners of the antebellum South, where folklore, tragedy, and resilience intertwine. This channel is not merely a repository for dates, battles, or economic statistics. It is a sanctuary for the forgotten, a place where we examine the profound psychological and spiritual dimensions of life under the crushing weight of human bondage. We invite you to look past the surface-level brutality of the institution, to understand the complex inner lives of those who endured it, their fears, their secrets, and the mysteries they carried to their graves. Today, our journey takes us to the suffocating humidity and moss-draped shadows of Marion County, Florida, in the year 1852. This was a time and place where the boundary between the natural world and the supernatural felt perilously thin, where the dense swamps seemed to hold ancient breaths, and where the logic of the Enlightenment often crumbled before the inexplicable realities of the plantation quarters. We are delving into the enigma of Ilara, a woman whose story challenges the very definitions of life and death. To understand Ilara, we must first understand the sacred and terrifying role of the plantation midwife. In the hierarchy of the enslaved community, the midwife was more than a medical practitioner. She was a spiritual gatekeeper, the first pair of hands to welcome a soul into a life of servitude, and often the last to comfort the dying. She walked the liminal space between worlds, commanding a respect that even the masters found difficult to suppress. But Ilara's case presents a deviation from the norm that is as chilling as it is fascinating. In a world where the lusty cry of a newborn was the universal signal of vitality, a sound that promised a mother her child lived, and promised a master his property was sound, Ilara brought forth only silence. This narrative is a deep exploration of that silence. It is an investigation into how a single, recurring physiological anomaly can dismantle the psychological order of a plantation. We will explore how this phenomenon of silent births became a Rorschach test for the fears and prejudices of 1852. To the enslaved mothers, was this silence a divine mercy? A sign that their children were being spared the immediate trauma of the world? Or was it a spiritual omen of doom? To the white overseers and the scientifically minded Dr. Thorne, was this a genetic defect, a contagious blight, or a subversive trick? As we unravel Ilara's unspoken secret, we are forced to confront the clash between the sterile, often cruel curiosity of 19th century medicine and the deep-rooted protective mysticism of the enslaved. This is a story about the power of the unexplained to generate terror. It is about the desperate need to find meaning in the midst of suffering and the dangerous consequences when a marginalized woman becomes the focal point of a master's paranoia. We are peeling back the layers of myth to find the human heart beating beneath the legend. If you are prepared to step into this atmospheric journey, to sit by the fire of a birthing cabin where the air is thick with tension and the impossible becomes real, we ask for your support. Please, take a moment to click the like button on this video. It is a small gesture, but it helps these lost stories find their way to new listeners, ensuring that the legacy of figures like Alara is never extinguished by the passage of time. And if you have not done so already, subscribe to Slavery Stories and activate notifications. We have opened the archives, and there are countless more mysteries waiting to be told. Now, let us descend into the silent, sweltering mystery of Riverbend Plantation, where a miracle is indistinguishable from a curse. To understand the anomaly that plagued Riverbend Plantation in 1852, one must first understand the soil from which Alara grew. Her story did not begin with the first silent cry she witnessed, but rather with the silence she herself brought into the world. Alara was born 18 years prior in the suffocating heat of a July night in Marion County, Florida. The archives of the plantation, usually meticulous in their accounting of property, listed her simply as girl healthy, born to Sarah. But oral history, whispered among the cabins and passed down through the smoke of evening fires, tells a different story. When Alara was pulled from the womb by her grandmother, the venerable midwife Mama Lou, the room held its breath, waiting for the wail of life. It never came. The infant Alara simply opened her eyes, described as unusually dark and piercing, and took a deep, rhythmic breath. No slap on the back, no splash of cold water could elicit a scream. She was born into the silence she would one day become the architect of. From the moment she could walk, Alara's destiny was sealed. On a plantation the size of Riverbend, where hundreds of souls labored under the brutal sun, the role of a midwife was not merely a job, it was a sacred trust, a position of power and terrifying responsibility. Mama Lou, with her gnarled hands and pockets full of snake root and blue cohosh, was the matriarch of medicine in the quarters. She saw in Alara's silence not a defect, but a sign. The spirits hold her tongue, Mama Lou would say, so her hands can listen. And so, Alara's childhood was spent not in play, but in the shadow of birth and death. She learned the texture of pain before she knew the alphabet. She learned to mix raspberry leaf tea to ease labor, and how to turn a breech baby while the mother stifled screams into a rag. By the time Alara was 16, Mama Lou's eyesight had begun to fail, clouded by cataracts that looked like milk spilled in water. The physical labor of the delivery, the guiding, the pulling, the catching, fell increasingly to Alara. It was during this transition of power, in the damp, moss-hung spring of 1850, that the pattern began to emerge. At first it was subtle. A field hand named Bessie went into labor during a thunderstorm. The thunder rattled the wooden slats of the cabin, drowning out Bessie's groans. When the child crowned, Alara's hands were the first to touch him. She guided him out, cleared his airway, and waited. The baby was pink, strong, and kicking. His chest rose and fell. But there was no sound. The storm raged outside, but in the circle of Alara's arms, there was a vacuum of noise. Mama Lou, squinting in the dim candlelight, had asked, "Is he breathing, child?" Alara had nodded, terrified. "He breathes, Mama, but he does not speak." They chalked it up to the storm, to the shock, to a fluke of nature. But then it happened again, and again. Throughout 1851, as Alara took on more deliveries solo, the phenomenon crystallized into a chilling reality. If Mama Lou delivered the child, the cabin would ring with the healthy, piercing squall of a newborn, a sound that signaled survival to the anxious father waiting outside. But if Alara's hands were the ones to break the water, if her fingers were the ones to sever the cord, The child would emerge in a state of supernatural tranquility. They were healthy. They were alive. But they were mute. This distinction began to weigh heavily on Alara's young soul. In the slave quarters, where superstition and faith were the only shields against a brutal existence, differences were dangerous. To be different was to attract the eye of the overseer, or worse, the devil. Alara began to dread the summons in the night. She would walk through the dark, humid paths of the plantation, the Spanish moss brushing her face like ghostly fingers, praying that the baby would cry. She tried everything. She rubbed their backs vigorously. She pinched their tiny heels. She whispered desperate pleas into their unhearing ears. "Cry," she would beg, tears streaming down her own face. "Please, just once, cry for me." But they never did. They would only look up at her with those wide, knowing eyes, breathing in the heavy Florida air, silent as the grave. By the winter of 1852, the burden had become an invisible yoke around her neck. The mothers began to look at her differently. The gratitude for a safe delivery was now tainted with a lingering unease. They would clutch their silent infants to their chests, eyeing Alara's hands as if they were covered in something unseen and irrevocable. It was an isolation more profound than chains. Alara realized that she was a conduit for something she could not name, a gatekeeper to a world where pain did not have a voice. She was no longer just a midwife in training. She was the carrier of a mystery that was slowly turning into a curse, isolating her in a crowded room, leaving her alone in the deafening silence of her own creation. By the time the heavy, suffocating humidity of 1853 began to cling to the Spanish moss of Riverbend Plantation, Alara had fully stepped out from the shadow of her grandmother. Mama Lou's hands had grown too tremulous to catch slippery newborns, and the mantle of the plantation's primary midwife had fallen squarely onto Alara's young shoulders. But with this elevation in status came a terrifying clarity, a realization that transformed her confusion into a cold, hard knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a statistical impossibility that defied nature itself. The silence was not random. The silence was her. To the enslaved community of Marion County, the birthing cabin was a place where the veil between life and death was thinnest. It was a place of blood, sweat, and prayer. When Auntie May, the other midwife on the plantation, a woman with rougher hands and a sharper tongue than Alara, took charge of a delivery, the rhythm of the night followed a familiar, chaotic cadence. Auntie May would bark orders for hot water and clean rags, her voice cutting through the humid air. And when the moment of truth arrived, when the infant was pulled from the womb, the cabin would erupt in sound. There was the wet slap of flesh, the gasp of the mother, and then, inevitably, that piercing, jagged wail of a new soul protesting its arrival into a world of bondage. That cry was ugly, loud, and jarring, but to the people of Riverbend, it was the most beautiful music in existence. It signified vigor. It signified survival. But when Alara knelt between a mother's legs, the world seemed to hold its breath. The difference was stark, undeniable, and chilling. Under Alara's touch, the labor pains were just as intense, the sweat just as profuse. But the climax was a vacuum of sound. She would guide the infant out with a gentleness that Auntie May lacked, her fingers moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost ritualistic. The baby would emerge, slick and perfect. The little chest would heave. The mouth would open wide in a mimicry of a scream. Faces would scrunch up in what looked like a wail. But nothing followed. No gurgle, no cry. Just the soft, rhythmic sound of tiny nostrils pulling in the swampy air. It was a silence so profound that the crackling of the fire in the hearth sounded like a roar in comparison. Alara began to dread the moment of delivery. She found herself staring at her own hands in the dim lantern light, turning them over and over, looking for some mark, some stain, some invisible sigil that marked her as different. Was she broken? Or worse, was she a conduit for something dark? She watched Auntie May deliver a colicky boy to a field hand named Bessie, and when the boy screamed until his face turned purple, Alara felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees. She wanted that noise. She craved the disruption. She wanted the validation that she hadn't stolen the voice from the child she held. This pattern did not go unnoticed by the mothers of the row. In the close-knit, whispered network of the slave quarters, observation was a survival skill, and nothing escaped the collective eye. At first, the silence had been treated as a fluke, perhaps even a blessing. A quiet baby was harder for the overseer to hear, harder to find fault with. But as the months dragged on and the roster of silent children grew, the mood shifted from curiosity to a creeping, superstitious fear. The women began to trade glances when Alara walked by. Conversations would abruptly cease, replaced by the scratching of brooms or the humming of old spirituals, low and protective. They started calling her children the hushed ones. It wasn't said with affection. It was whispered with a shudder. Alara could feel the change in the air when she entered a cabin to check on a pregnant woman. The gratitude that used to greet her was replaced by a tense, wide-eyed compliance. Mothers would clutch their swollen bellies a little tighter, their eyes darting to Auntie May's cabin down the row, silently wishing for the older woman's ruff, hands over Alara's silent touch. They feared that Alara was doing something to the baby's souls, that in the process of bringing them earthside, she was keeping a piece of them for herself, or perhaps that she had made a pact with spirits that demanded quiet payment. One evening, Alara overheard two women washing clothes by the creek. "It ain't natural, Hattie," one whispered, her voice carrying over the water. "A baby got to cry to let the devil out. If they don't cry, the devil stays in." The words struck Alara like a physical blow. The isolation was no longer just professional, it was existential. She was becoming a pariah in the only community she had ever known. The silence of the newborns was bleeding into her own life, creating a barrier of fear between her and her people. She was the keeper of life, yet she walked among them like a harbinger of something unnatural. And deep down, in the quietest corners of her own heart, Alara began to wonder if they were right. Had she, unknowingly, been cursed to bring forth a generation of ghosts? In the rigid, suffocating hierarchy of the antebellum South, secrets were a luxury that the enslaved could rarely afford. On Riverbend Plantation, the whispers of the silent ones eventually drifted from the quarters, carried by house servants and overseers, until they reached the mahogany desk of Mr. Silas Caldwell. To Caldwell, the owner of Riverbend, this was not a matter of mysticism or spiritual wonder. It was a matter of economics. A slave child who did not cry might be defective, weak, or, worst of all, dying. Silence, in the brutal calculus of chattel slavery, looked like a bad investment. Unwilling to rely on the folk remedies of the quarters, Caldwell sent a summons to St. Augustine, calling for a man of science to root out this anomaly. Enter Dr. Elias Thorne. Young, ambitious, and armed with the arrogant certainty of mid-19th century medicine, Thorne arrived at Riverbend not as a healer, but as an investigator. He was a man of the Enlightenment, trained to believe that every biological mystery had a physiological cause that could be measured, cut, and categorized. He viewed the stories of Alara's silent births with open disdain, dismissing them as the hysterical superstitions of an uneducated workforce. He arrived with his leather satchels heavy with steel instruments, forceps, lancets, and stethoscopes, tools designed to pry open the secrets of the human body. To him, Ilara was not a gifted midwife. She was merely an obstacle, an untrained woman whose methods needed to be audited and corrected. The intrusion into the birthing cabin was immediate and jarring. For generations, the birthing space had been a sanctuary of female solidarity, a dimly lit realm of herbs, prayer, and the rhythmic breathing of laboring women. Dr. Thorne shattered that sanctity. He demanded the shutters be thrown open for better light, banishing the comforting shadows Ilara used to soothe the mothers. He paced the small dirt floor, his polished boots contrasting sharply with the humble surroundings, checking his pocket watch with impatient clicks. For Ilara, the pressure was suffocating. She was no longer just guiding a life into the world. She was performing under the hostile, clinical gaze of a man who held the power to destroy her with a single word to Master Caldwell. The test came on a humid Tuesday, with a young field hand named Bess in the throes of labor. As the contractions intensified, Thorne did not offer comfort. Instead, he hovered, interfering with Ilara's movements, questioning her use of sage and oil, and noting the mother's dilation with a cold, detached efficiency. He was waiting for the failure. He was waiting for the moment he could prove that this silence was merely asphyxia caused by incompetent midwifery. When the moment of delivery arrived, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Ilara's hands, steady despite her fear, guided the infant out. It was a boy, slick and healthy, his limbs thrashing against the sudden freedom of the air. Thorne leaned in, his face inches from the newborn, his brow furrowed in anticipation of the gasp, the choke, and the inevitable wail that signaled life. He watched the infant's chest heave. He saw the mouth open wide, the tiny tongue curling back in a perfect mimicry of a scream. But there was no sound. Nothing. Not a wheeze, not a gurgle, not a cry. Just a deep, rhythmic intake of air, followed by a silent exhalation. The silence was absolute, defying every medical instinct Thorne possessed. The doctor snatched the child from Ilara's hands, shocking the mother, Bess, who lay exhausted on the pallet. Thorne turned the baby over, slapping its back firmly, then harder, trying to dislodge an obstruction that didn't exist. He pried open the infant's mouth, peering into the throat, expecting to find a cleft palate or a blockage. The airway was clear. The lungs were filling. The heart was beating with a strong, vigorous rhythm against his stethoscope. For the first time since his arrival, the arrogance drained from Elias Thorne's face, replaced by a profound, unsettling confusion. The biology made no sense. A healthy set of lungs, a healthy larynx, yet a total absence of vibration. He looked at Ilara, who stood silently in the corner, her hands folded, her eyes downcast but knowing. He realized then that he was witnessing something that his textbooks in St. Augustine had never prepared him for. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. The birth was no longer a medical procedure. It became a specimen study. Thorne did not hand the child back to its mother immediately. Instead, he pulled out a leather-bound journal. He began to write furiously, documenting the time, the atmospheric conditions, the mother's pulse, and the eerie, unnatural tranquility of the newborn. He measured the circumference of the head, the length of the fingers, looking for a physical marker of this curse. The birthing cabin had ceased to be a place of life. Under Dr. Thorne's pen, it had transformed into a laboratory, and Ilara, watching him sketch the anatomy of the silent child, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She realized that the master's curiosity was far more dangerous than his anger. Anger might earn a whipping, but this scientific obsession? This scrutiny? It threatened to expose them all to a darkness far worse than the lash. Up until the late summer of 1852, the phenomenon at Riverbend Plantation had been viewed through a lens of uneasy curiosity. To the enslaved community, it was a portent. To the masters, a biological oddity. But as the humidity rose and the air grew thick with the scent of stagnant marsh water, the silence surrounding Alara's midwifery shifted from a mysterious miracle into a terrifying tragedy. The turning point arrived with Cora, a young field hand whose resilience had not yet been ground down by the lash, but whose heart was about to be shattered by a quietness she could not comprehend. Cora had labored for 14 hours in the stifling heat of a sharecropper's cabin, with Alara by her side, wiping her brow and murmuring ancient comforts. When the child, a boy, finally emerged, he arrived with that signature Riverbend silence. There was no cry, no gasp, only the soft, rhythmic motion of a chest rising and falling. At first, Alara felt the familiar wash of relief. Another life delivered. Another soul slipped quietly into bondage without the indignity of a scream. But within the hour, the atmosphere in the cabin darkened. The infant's silence, usually accompanied by a robust, eerie calm, began to look like suffocation. His skin, initially a rich mahogany, took on a gray, ashen pallor. His chest heaved, fighting for air that seemed to refuse him, yet he made no sound of distress. No wheeze, no cough, no whimper. It was a silent suffocation, a mute drowning in the open air. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Cora. She clutched the swaddled bundle to her chest, her eyes wide with a primal terror, rocking back and forth as she watched the life drain from her son without a single auditory signal. Dr. Elias Thorne was summoned immediately. The young physician, whose fascination with Alara's cases had filled pages of his journals, arrived with his leather satchel and an air of scientific determination. He placed his stethoscope against the infant's tiny ribcage, his brow furrowing as he listened. He heard the heart beating, faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. But the lungs remained bafflingly clear of fluid. There was no obstruction, no pneumonia, nothing that his medical training in Augustine could identify. The child was simply fading, his vitality evaporating into the ether. It was then that Cora's grief transmuted into rage. In her delirium of loss, she looked not at the doctor, but at the midwife. "You did this," she hissed, her voice cracking with the weight of her sorrow. "You put a hex on him. You took his voice, and now you take in his breath." The accusation hung heavy in the room, more suffocating than the heat. It was the first time one of their own had turned on Alara, naming the silence as a curse rather than a mercy. Word of the dying asset reached the main house, bringing Silas Caldwell to the quarters. The master of Riverbend did not see a tragedy. He saw a ledger entry turning red. He saw lost capital. He saw a future field hand perishing before he could even hold a hoe. Caldwell stood in the doorway, blocking out the sunlight, his presence dominating the small space. He ignored the weeping mother and the baffled doctor, fixing his gaze on Alara. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Why do your hands bring death now, girl? Why do they not cry?" Alara stood frozen. How could she explain what she herself did not understand? How could she tell him that the silence felt like a protection, even as it turned deadly? Her silence was interpreted as insolence. Caldwell, fueled by the frustration of financial loss and the eerie nature of the situation, struck. It was not a corrective slap, but a brutal backhand that sent Alara to the dirt floor. He loomed over her, the threat of the whip hanging in the air like static electricity. "If another one dies quietly," Caldwell spat, pointing a trembling finger at her, "I will strip the skin from your back and send you to the cane fields where no one will hear you scream." The threat was existential. As Ilara lay in the dust of the cabin floor, listening to the final, soundless breaths of Cora's son, she felt a crushing weight settle upon her soul. The gift she thought she possessed, the ability to bring peace to the newborns, had curdled. She was no longer a guardian of the threshold. In the eyes of her people and her master, she had become a harbinger of a silent blight. The unique burden of her existence had transformed from a spiritual mystery into a direct threat to her survival, leaving her isolated in a world that demanded answers she could not give. The scars on Ilara's back from Mr. Caldwell's lash were beginning to knit together, turning from angry red wheals into silver lines of permanent memory. Yet, the physical pain was a distant, dull throb compared to the cavernous hollow that had opened up inside her chest. The death of Cora's child had shattered the fragile truce Ilara held with her own existence. She walked through the slave quarters of Riverbend Plantation like a specter, her eyes downcast, feeling the weight of a dozen silent accusations burning into her skin. The other women, who once looked to her with gratitude, now averted their gazes, clutching their swollen bellies or their living children a little tighter when she passed. The silence that Ilara brought into the world had curdled. It was no longer a mystery, but a harbinger of doom. Isolated by grief and the terrifying ambiguity of her own hands, Ilara sought the only sanctuary left to her, the cabin of Mama Lou. Mama Lou was the oldest living soul on the plantation, a woman whose skin was like cracked parchment, and whose mind was said to wander the space between the living and the dead. She lay on a pallet of corn husks, the air in her small shack thick with the scent of dried sage, stagnant swamp water, and old age. Ilara sat beside her, the flickering light of a tallow candle casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn timber walls. She poured out her heart, confessing the crushing guilt, the fear that Dr. Thorne was right, that she was broken, a vessel of some unseen blight that stole the breath from the innocent. Mama Lou listened, her eyes, clouded milky white with cataracts, fixed on a point in the darkness that only she could see. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry rattle, like wind moving through dead leaves, yet it carried an authority that made the humid air in the room turn cold. She did not speak of medical failures or curses. She spoke of the spirit children. "Child," Mama Lou rasped, her hand gripping Ilara's wrist with surprising strength. "You listen to the wind in the cypress trees? It don't scream, it whispers. These babies, they ain't born broken. They are born knowing." The old woman spun a tale that predated the chains and the cotton, a story carried across the ocean in the bellies of slave ships. She spoke of souls that walked the threshold between worlds, the spirit children, who chose silence as a shield. In a world defined by the crack of the whip and the auctioneer's shout, a cry was a beacon to the oppressor. To be born silent, Mama Lou insisted, was to be born hidden, invisible to the malevolent spirits, and perhaps safe from the worst of the master's gaze. This revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It reframed her entire existence. What if her touch didn't steal the cry, but suppressed it for protection? What if she was not a killer, but a guardian at the gate? The idea was terrifying, bordering on blasphemy against the white man's God she was forced to worship on Sundays, but it took root in her desperate heart. Armed with this new, fragile understanding, Ilara returned to her duties with a transformed perspective. The next time she was called to the birthing bed, the air was thick with tension. The mother was terrified, the father pacing outside in the dust. When the child emerged, a boy slick with blood and fluids, the room held its breath. The silence came, absolute and heavy. But this time, Ilara did not panic. She did not strike the child to force a wail. Instead, she cleaned him with trembling reverence, peering deeply into his dark, unblinking eyes. She looked for the signs Mama Lou had hinted at, and there, in the unnatural stillness of the infant, she saw it. The child did not look distressed. He looked observant. His gaze was too focused, too deep for a newborn, as if he were already assessing the brutal world he had entered and deciding to withhold his voice from it. He was breathing, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, silent cadence that felt less like a medical anomaly and more like a meditative trance. The shift in Ilara was subtle but palpable. She moved with a new, eerie grace, handling the silent infants like sacred artifacts. The fear in the quarters didn't vanish, but it mutated. The whispers among the enslaved community changed texture. They no longer spoke of Ilara as the woman who brought death, but as the woman who knew secrets too deep for the white masters to comprehend. A complex mixture of fear, respect, and a desperate, clawing hope began to surround her. Mothers started to wonder if Ilara's silence was a mercy, a way to cheat the system that claimed their children's lives before they even began. Ilara had become something other than a midwife. She was now the keeper of the quiet gate, and the burden of that key weighed heavier than any chain. As the humid Florida summer of 1852 bore down on Marion County, the atmosphere at Riverbend Plantation shifted from bewildered curiosity to a volatile hostility. The scientific curiosity that had initially brought Dr. Elias Thorne to the estate was beginning to curdle into a dangerous, aggressive frustration. For Thorne, a man who worshipped at the altar of empirical evidence, the silence of Ilara's newborns was not just a medical anomaly, it was a personal insult to his education. His initial notes, written in neat, scholarly cursive, had degraded into erratic scrawls of confusion. He could find no physiological obstruction in the infants' throats, no fluid in their lungs, and no neurological deficits. They were perfect specimens of health, yet they withheld the very sound that defined life. Thorne's methodology grew invasive. He ceased being an observer and became an intruder. He began demanding access to the infants immediately after birth, pushing Ilara aside with rough, trembling hands. He brought cold steel calipers to measure their cranial dimensions and forced wooden tongue depressors into their small mouths, desperate to find a deformity that would validate his worldview. He spoke of laryngeal paralysis and congenital apathy, terms that meant nothing to the enslaved mothers, but served to mask his own impotence. He even proposed to Silas Caldwell that they perform a vivisection on a stillborn, should one occur, to examine the vocal cords directly, a suggestion that sent a ripple of absolute terror through the slave quarters. To the mothers, Thorne was no longer a doctor. He was a vulture waiting for a carcass. However, Silas Caldwell was a man of ledgers, not science. While Thorne worried about anatomy, Caldwell worried about assets. The plantation owner watched the growing unrest among his workforce with a paranoid eye. Silence was unnatural, and in the antebellum South, anything unnatural among the enslaved population was viewed as a precursor to rebellion. He feared that this silence was a code, a secret language, or a sign that his human property was being damaged at the source. When science failed to provide a quick fix, Caldwell turned to the oldest tool of control available to him: religion. He summoned the Reverend Josiah Finch from a neighboring parish. Reverend Finch was a gaunt, severe man whose theology was built on fire, brimstone, and the absolute subjugation of the spirit. He arrived at Riverbend not with medical bags, but with a leather-bound Bible and a conviction that the devil was walking the swamps. After listening to Caldwell's complaints and observing Ilara from a distance, Finch offered a diagnosis that required no autopsy. He declared that Ilara was a vessel of demonic influence. He preached that she had made a covenant with dark spirits, trading the cries of the innocent for some unseen, nefarious power. To Finch, the silence was not a medical mystery. It was the quiet before the storm of God's wrath. He urged Caldwell to cleanse the plantation, suggesting that Ilara be whipped until she confessed her witchcraft, or banished entirely to save the souls of the other slaves. Ilara found herself trapped in a terrifying vice. On one side stood Dr. Thorne, representing the cold, unyielding blade of scientific inquiry that viewed her and the babies as biological puzzles to be taken apart. On the other stood Reverend Finch, a man who saw her very existence as an affront to God, demanding spiritual warfare against a woman whose only crime was delivering life. And looming over them both was Silas Caldwell, whose patience had evaporated. In a private, chilling confrontation behind the main house, Caldwell delivered his ultimatum. He cared little for Thorne's theories or Finch's demons. He cared about order. He told Ilara, with a voice devoid of pity, that if the next child she delivered did not cry, if she did not break the curse that she had allegedly cast, he would sell her. She would be stripped of her position, separated from her family, and sold down the river to the sugarcane fields of Louisiana, a fate often considered a death sentence. The tension on Riverbend was now absolute. Ilara was no longer just a midwife. She was a woman standing on the precipice of annihilation, holding the weight of an entire community's silence in her trembling hands. The atmosphere inside the main house of Riverbend Plantation on that stifling August afternoon in 1852 was not one of anticipation, but of an inquisition. This was no longer a matter of childbirth. It was a trial, presided over by three men who held the power of life, death, and salvation over everyone in the room. Silas Caldwell, desperate to secure his financial assets, had ordered the unthinkable. A slave woman, Sarah, was to give birth not in the familiar, earthen-floored safety of the midwife's cabin, but in the parlor of the big house. The velvet curtains were drawn against the sun, trapping the heat and the smell of stale tobacco, creating a suffocating stage for what Caldwell termed a necessary demonstration. Ilara stood by the makeshift birthing table, her hands trembling imperceptibly as she arranged her basins of water and clean rags. Across the room, the tribunal watched. Dr. Elias Thorne sat with a notebook open, his face a mask of clinical detachment, pen hovering like a scalpel. Beside him stood the Reverend Josiah Finch, clutching his Bible with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes scanning the shadows of the room for signs of the demonic influence he had preached about the Sunday prior. And pacing behind them was Caldwell himself, a man whose patience had eroded into a dangerous, volatile anger. He needed the baby to cry. He needed the natural order to be restored, or he needed a scapegoat to punish for its disruption. Sarah, young and terrified, lay gripping the edges of the fine mahogany table, her sweat soaking into the expensive linens beneath her. She was not just laboring to bring a child into the world. She was laboring under the weight of the white gaze. Every groan she suppressed, every writhe of pain she hid, was an attempt to make herself invisible, even as she was the center of attention. Ilara leaned close to her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, whispering words of encouragement that were too low for the men to hear. "Look at me, child," Ilara murmured, her voice a steady anchor in the rising storm. "Just look at me. Breathe with me. Forget them." But forgetting them was impossible. Dr. Thorne would occasionally rise, crossing the room to check Sarah's pulse or inspect the progression of labor with cold, unfeeling efficiency. He did not speak to the women. He spoke only to his notebook, muttering observations about dilation and heart rates, treating the event as a biological experiment. Reverend Finch, conversely, muttered prayers under his breath, a low, rhythmic chanting that sounded less like a blessing and more like an exorcism. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the electric charge of an approaching storm. As the hours dragged on and the sun began to dip low, casting long, distorted shadows across the parlor floor, the moment of delivery arrived. The room fell into a profound, unnatural stillness. Even Caldwell stopped his pacing. Sarah's body convulsed with the final, racking pains of birth. She let out a guttural, raw sound, a testament to her suffering, that echoed off the high ceilings. Ilara moved with practiced grace, her hands guiding, soothing, and receiving. She felt the head crown, felt the shoulders slip free, and in that split second, she felt the familiar, terrifying rush of cold air that always accompanied her deliveries. "Push, Sarah. One last time," Ilara commanded softly. With a final, exhausting effort, the child slipped into Ilara's waiting hands. It was a boy, perfectly formed, his skin slick and gleaming in the dim light. The room held its breath. This was the moment. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. Finch raised his Bible like a shield. Caldwell took a step closer, his jaw clenched. Ilara quickly cleared the infant's airway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited. They all waited. The baby's chest heaved. His small mouth opened wide, a cavern ready to release a wail of life. His lungs filled visibly, expanding against his ribs. And then, silence. There was no piercing cry, no squall of protest against the cold world. The baby simply exhaled, a long, soft sigh that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. He blinked his eyes open, dark and aware, looking up at Ilara with a calmness that defied nature. He breathed rhythmically, deeply, but utterly without sound. Dr. Thorne stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He stared at the child, his scientific mind reeling, unable to categorize a healthy, breathing infant that refused to scream. He looked at his instruments, then at Ilara, his face pale with confusion. Reverend Finch recoiled, stumbling back as if physically struck. "It is the silence of the grave," he whispered, his voice trembling with superstitious horror. "The devil has stolen his tongue." But it was Silas Caldwell's reaction that sealed Ilara's fate. The master of Riverbend didn't see a medical anomaly or a spiritual omen. He saw defiance. He saw a flaw in his property that he could not beat or breed out. His face turned a deep, violent shade of crimson. The silence of the newborn was deafening, louder than any scream could have been, and it hung in the parlor like a verdict. Ilara held the silent child against her chest, shielding him, but she knew. As she looked up and met Caldwell's hateful stare, she knew that this public miracle was her private sentence. The trial was over, and the judgment had been passed without a single word spoken. The silence that filled the birthing room after Sarah's delivery was not peaceful. To Silas Caldwell, it was deafening. It was a silence that screamed of insurrection, of a power dynamic shifting in a way he could neither quantify nor control. As the newborn's chest rose and fell in perfect, rhythmic quietude, Caldwell did not see a miracle. He saw a contagion. The awe in the eyes of the enslaved women gathered near the door, the confusion on Dr. Thorne's face. It all pointed to one undeniable fact. Ilara had become something more than property. She had become a symbol, and in the brutal calculus of the antebellum South, a symbol that could not be broken had to be removed. Caldwell stormed from the cabin, his boots crushing the dry earth, his decision already calcifying in his mind. This was no longer about medical curiosity or productivity. It was about the preservation of order. That evening, the atmosphere in the main house was suffocating. Caldwell summoned Dr. Thorne to his study, a room that, smelled of stale whiskey and old leather. The planter's demeanor was cold, stripped of the earlier panic, replaced by a ruthless pragmatism. He looked at the young physician, whose hands were still shaking slightly from the inexplicable event he had just witnessed. Caldwell didn't ask for a medical explanation anymore. Instead, he issued a command that would sever the link between science and history. He ordered Thorne to burn the journals. Every observation, every chart, every note regarding the silent births was to be reduced to ash in the fireplace before dawn. "There is no anomaly here, Doctor," Caldwell stated, his voice low and threatening. "There is only hysteria. And if I find that one word of this gets published in your northern medical gazettes, I will ensure your reputation is as dead as those records." Thorne, caught between his scientific integrity and the terrifying reality of Caldwell's influence, nodded slowly. The erasure had begun. Next, Caldwell turned his attention to the spiritual. Reverend Josiah Finch, who had been loudly proclaiming Alara a witch in the quarters, was brought in. Caldwell, however, did not want an exorcism. He understood that fear of the devil could quickly turn into a frenzy that disrupted the harvest. He leaned across his desk, fixing the preacher with a glare that promised violence. "You will stop this talk of demons, Josiah," Caldwell warned. "You are stirring them up. If the hands are too terrified to work, or if they start believing this woman has power over life and death, I lose money. You will preach obedience next Sunday, not hellfire. Alara is gone. That is the only gospel they need to hear." Finch, deflated and cowed, agreed to silence his brimstone rhetoric. The machinery of the plantation moved swiftly. Caldwell arranged for a slaver passing through Ocala to take possession of Alara before the sun fully rose. He didn't care where she went: Louisiana cane fields, the fever-ridden swamps of Mississippi, as long as it was far enough that her name would never drift back on the wind. He was selling her cheap, a frantic liquidation of a dangerous asset. The following morning, the mist still clung to the ground at Riverbend Plantation when the wagon arrived. It was a nondescript transport, the kind used for livestock or supplies, but the chains rattled with a distinct, grim purpose. 2 overseers dragged Alara from her cabin. She did not fight. She did not plead. True to the nature of the children she had brought into the world, Alara remained utterly silent. Her face was a mask of unreadable stoicism, her eyes fixed on a horizon that only she could see. The commotion drew the community out. From the doorways of the shacks, men and women watched in a paralyzed vigil. They saw the woman who had caught their babies, the woman who carried the mystery in her hands, being hoisted onto the wagon bed like a sack of grain. No one dared to shout. The presence of the overseers with their whips was a sharp reminder of the consequences. But the air was heavy with a collective grief that transcended sound. As the wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding into the dirt, Alara did not look back at the master's house. She looked at them, the mothers holding their silent children. Caldwell watched from the veranda, a tumbler of morning bourbon in his hand, believing he had excised the cancer from his land. He thought that by removing the midwife, he would restore the natural order of screams and cries. But as Ilara's figure became a silhouette in the distance, disappearing into the dust and the tree line, he failed to realize what he had actually done. He hadn't erased her. By denying her a proper goodbye, by shrouded her departure in mystery and force, he had turned the woman into a martyr. The wagon faded from view, leaving behind a void that felt heavier than her presence ever had. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was waiting. Time, much like the swamps of Florida, has a way of swallowing the truth, pulling it down into the muck until it is forgotten. For over a century, the story of Alara and the silent children of Riverbend Plantation ceased to be history. It evaporated into folklore, becoming a ghost story whispered on the porches of sharecroppers' cabins, and later, in the living rooms of their descendants. She became a myth, the midwife of silence, a figure used to frighten children or explain away the unexplainable. The official records of Marion County said nothing of her. The census reports of 1850 and 1860 listed slaves only by age and gender, nameless tallies of property. By all administrative accounts, Ilara never existed. The silence she brought into the world seemed to have consumed her legacy as well. But the past is rarely as buried as the powerful would like it to be. It waits, patient and preserving, for someone willing to dig. In the humid summer of 1974, that someone was Dr. Eleanor Vance. A young, tenacious historian from Howard University, Vance had traveled to Florida not to find ghosts, but to research the economic transition of cotton plantations after the Civil War. Her search led her to the basement archives of the Marion County Historical Society, a dimly lit, windowless room that smelled of mildew, decaying paper, and the slow rot of time. For weeks, Eleanor sifted through tax receipts, land deeds, and crop manifests, finding only the cold mathematics of slavery. But on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked behind a mislabeled box of agricultural surveys from the 1920s, she found something that didn't belong. It was a small, leather-bound book, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, that had grown stiff and brittle with age. The leather was cracked, stained with what looked like dried mud or perhaps blood, and embossed on the cover were the faded initials, E.T. When Eleanor opened the book, the spine cracked with a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet archive. It was a medical journal, though handwriting inside was elegant, precise, the mark of an educated man. The name on the flyleaf confirmed its owner, Dr. Elias Thorne, Augustine, 1852. The early pages were mundane, filled with treatments for heat exhaustion, malaria, and the common injuries of brutal plantation labor. But as Eleanor turned to the entries dated late October 1852, the tone of the writing shifted. The ink grew darker, the pen strokes more jagged and hurried. Thorne had stopped recording medical treatments and started recording a phenomenon. He wrote of the subject Ilara and the aberration of the vocal cords in neonates. Eleanor sat on the cold, concrete floor, mesmerized as she read the private confessions of a man whose scientific worldview had been shattered. Thorne described the births in meticulous, terrified detail. November 3rd, one entry read, "Another male child delivered by her hands. The lungs are clear. The airway is unobstructed. The child breathes. He looks about with eyes far too old for a newborn, but he makes no sound. It is as if the very air in this cabin refuses to carry their cry. I pricked the child's heel with a needle, a cruelty, I admit, to elicit a response. The infant merely watched me. He did not scream. God help me, he judged me." This was the smoke and gun. For the first time, there was material proof that the legends were true. But as Eleanor read on, the journal revealed something darker than just supernatural speculation. It revealed a conspiracy. Thorne's later entries were frantic, documenting his clashes with Silas Caldwell. He wrote of the master's growing paranoia, his fear that the silence was a contagion that would devalue his stock. The most chilling entry was dated just days before the journal ended abruptly. "Caldwell has ordered the purge," Thorne scrawled, the handwriting barely legible. "He demands I burn my notes. He intends to sell the woman south, to scatter the silent ones, to erase this blight from Riverbend's history. He believes that if we destroy the records, we destroy the truth. But I cannot burn this. Science demands a witness, even if that witness is a coward." Dr. Vance realized she was holding the only surviving testimony of a crime that went beyond the physical brutality of slavery. It was a psychological erasure. Thorne had saved the ledger not out of altruism, but out of an obsessive need to preserve the anomaly he couldn't solve. He had hidden it away, likely stealing it from the plantation, before he was dismissed or fled, defying Caldwell's order to incinerate the memory of Alara. In that dusty basement, surrounded by the bureaucratic debris of a fallen era, the silence of the room felt heavy, charged. Dr. Vance traced her finger over the ink, now over 100 years dry. The myth had become flesh and blood again. Alara was no longer just a whisper in the dust. She was a woman who had terrified the men who thought they owned her. And though Caldwell had tried to bury her story in the swamps, this hidden ledger had clawed its way back to the surface, demanding to be read. As Dr. Eleanor Vance turned the fragile, yellowed pages of the ledger, the fluorescent lights of the archive seemed to dim, replaced by the flickering candle flame of a mid-19th century plantation office. This was no longer just a medical record. It was a confession etched in ink and gilt. The further she read, the more the clinical facade of Dr. Elias Thorne crumbled. His handwriting, initially precise and aristocratic, deteriorated into jagged, frantic scrawls over the course of 3 years. Vance discovered that Thorne's obsession had moved beyond the mere absence of crying. He had begun to track the developmental anomalies of the children Alara had delivered, the silent ones, as he came to call them. In an entry dated August 14, 1854, Thorne noted with a mixture of scientific fascination and superstitious dread that these children possessed a terrifying resilience. When a wave of cholera swept through the slave quarters, decimating the workforce and claiming the lives of both the young and the old, the children born of Alara's hands remained untouched. Thorne described their immunity as unnatural, noting that their skin remained cool to the touch, even as the heat of the Florida summer caused the air itself to shimmer. "They do not burn with fever," he wrote, the ink blotched, as if the pen had been pressed down with force. "They observe the suffering around them with eyes that are too old for their faces, their chests rising and falling in that maddening, silent rhythm. It is as if death itself does not recognize them, because they announced no arrival." But it was the auditory observations that truly chilled Dr. Vance. Thorne had conducted cruel, rudimentary experiments to test their hearing, convinced they were deaf. He recorded that while the infants would not react to the soothing lullabies of their mothers or the loud, boisterous laughter of the other children, they exhibited a violent, synchronized reaction to the sounds of authority and pain. The crack of an overseer's whip, the tolling of the plantation bell that signaled the start of a grueling shift, or the heavy thud of a boot on wooden floorboards. These specific frequencies triggered an immediate physical response. The children would freeze, their bodies going rigid, their eyes widening in a collective, silent panic. "They are born anticipating the whip," Thorne surmised in a margin note, his skepticism entirely replaced by horror. "Alara has not just silenced their voices, she has tuned their very souls to the frequency of their oppression. They are listening for the danger before they can even crawl." The ledger's final pages were a descent into madness. After Alara's forced removal and sale, the entries became sporadic and nonsensical. Thorne wrote of being haunted not by a ghost, but by an absence. He claimed that the silence Alara left behind was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums at night. "I wake in the dark," the last entry read, "and I scream just to hear something, anything, break this suffocating void. But the room absorbs the sound. She has taken the noise of the world with her, and I am left in the vacuum." The journal ended there, not with a period, but with a streak of ink, as if the book had been shut violently, or the writer had been dragged away. Compelled by the weight of these revelations, Dr. Vance felt she could not leave the story confined to the paper. She drove out to the coordinates of the old Riverbend estate. The mansion was long gone, burned during the chaos of the Civil War or reclaimed by the rot of the swamp, but the land remained. It was an overgrown tangle of palmettos and ancient oaks, draped in Spanish moss that hung like gray, tattered rags. The air was thick, humid, and buzzing with the relentless drone of cicadas. Vance walked through the tall grass, guided by old maps, until she stood where the slave quarters and Alara's cabin would have been. She closed her eyes, trying to bridge the gap of a century. She listened to the wind rusting through the canopy, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of lizards in the dry leaves. And then it happened. The wind died. The cicadas ceased their song instantly. The heavy Florida air became still, creating a vacuum of sound that mirrored Thorne's description perfectly. In that absolute, impossible silence, Dr. Vance felt a chill race down her spine, despite the oppressive heat. It wasn't empty silence. It was occupied. From the ground beneath her feet, from the roots of the trees that had witnessed the atrocities of the past, a sound emerged. It was not a voice. It was not a cry. It was a collective intake of breath, hundreds of tiny lungs filling with air. A soft, rhythmic, unified exhalation that brushed against her consciousness like a physical touch. It was a whisper that carried no words, only a profound, enduring presence. It was the sound of survival, hiding in the shadows, waiting out the cruelty of history. Alara's legacy had not vanished into the dust. It had merely learned that, in a world of pain, silence was the only sanctuary. And as the wind picked up again, carrying the noise of the modern world back into the clearing, Dr. Vance knew that the story of the Riverbend midwife was not a tragedy of erasure, but a triumph of endurance.